My name is Bruce Bolger, and I'm the founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance, and I'm pleased to be here today on one of our strategic programs on negotiating labor agreements in the era of stakeholder capitalism. I now see that typo. Silly me. In any case, we're very lucky to have experts on this subject to talk about exactly how labor and management relations can look in a world where we define stakeholder capitalism as enhancing returns for investors by creating value for employees, customers, supply chain, and distribution partners, communities, and the environment. And to help us kind of hit the reset button on labor management relations, which are going to become very relevant, as everyone can see today, we have Joel Kucher Gershenfeld. He's Florence G. Heller Professor and Social Impact MBA Director at Brandeis University, right outside of Boston. Dennis Dabney, he's Senior Vice President for National Labor Relations, Kaiser Permanente. He's retired now, but he's also now Labor Relations Director at HR Policy Association for the HR Policy Association. We have Kim Leary. She's Senior Vice President for Research Management and Program Development for the Urban Institute and Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School and Associate Professor in Health Policy and Management at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Again, showing the degree of expertise we have Chris Rondo, co-lead organizer of the Harvard Clerical and Technical Union, the SHARE Union, and others, and director of Ask Me, that's a long acronym, Chris, for New England. And we have Cern Cern, I forgot, and you'll tell us how we properly pronounce your name. I would say VMOs, but I forgot to ask. So you are advisor, mediator, and co-founder of Denmark's Kollevig Center for Negotiations and Conflict Resolution. So we truly have experts to talk about this issue. And then moving on quickly, we always like to thank our customers. None of their money actually goes to doing this work. These are companies that we help achieve their business objectives in helping their clients implement the practical element of stakeholder management at the front lines. And finally, we are a stakeholder capitalist organization. We give away a ton of information. Literally, someone can learn everything about stakeholder capitalism, never have to spend a day. We have actually a free curriculum. So that's it for our advertisement here. But now I'd like to really get into the crux of the matter and thank all of our panelists for attending. So there's been a lot of theatrics lately, Joel. I'm going to start with you. And I'm not going to get into specific labor cases, but what I hear is the old language of demands, threats, depriving people of their dignity. Are we still in the old world of labor management, or is there an opportunity for management and labor to work together to enhance the workforce?
And actually, before we begin, I just learned that something may have come up for Kim that may be an issue. So if she has to leave, we'll understand. But this is an era in which employee dignity, employee voice, coming not just from the new generation workforce, but really from all people in the workforce, is becoming more important. And it's a time where the level of unionization in the United States is growing at an accelerating rate for connected reasons. The reason we're here today is because too many folks are forming new labor management partnerships or relationships on an adversarial basis rather than a partnership. And there is abundant evidence, in fact, many examples are out there of parties bargaining in a more problem-solving way that achieves mutual gains and that in fact takes into account the interest of multiple stakeholders in society. So we really want to share with your members and with others more broadly a commitment to a form of collective bargaining that actually is better for society.
So, Chris, I believe you're on the labor side of this, I believe, correct?
That's right.
Again, I don't want to get into mentioning any specific companies, but it was very disheartening in recent negotiations. And again, I understand why workers get upset with management. There's no disagreement with that. But is negotiation starting with saying to people, we're going to force you to do things, we're going to make demands? Is management the cause for that type of so Kim, please, we understand. Kim has had to leave us, and family or whatever are more important than any of this. So thank you so much. Chris, getting to the labor side of this. Has management been so disrespectful to labor and so with their ears so closed to labor that we have to start negotiations by going on national TV and pointing fingers at people and threatening them, not with violence, but with, of course, economic disaster? Is that where we're still at today?
Yeah, I think that that maybe we are. I mean, I think it's a choice, right, for management, and it's a choice for labor of how we're going to act, how we're going to organize. But it's I've been involved for 40 or 50 years. It's not Workers are not happier than they were 50 years ago. They're less happy. And I was amazed during the pandemic because I've been organizing workers all my life. And I wanted to say to them when they told me during the shutdown, I'm never going back. I will never go back. And I I was surprised. I thought that, in my profession, I never thought I would see or hear that day when that happens. And if you organize in this country, the primary way you do that is to organize against something, which maybe automatically leads labor management down a bumpy path. And if you are being organized, you resist and fight and run an anti-union campaign, and that leads people down a bumpy path. So we have early decisions to make about how we're going to be, what kind of culture we're going to create, how we're going to work with each other, and these decisions get made before we even know each other. They're just at this point, they're in the air we breathe.
They're in the air.
And by the way, Bruce, Chris is a leader in the labor movement for an alternative path, which is much more about building community, making one-to-one connections among workers, and beginning a collective bargaining conversation on the basis of mutual respect, but also on the basis of literally knowing every member of a bargaining unit and having a one-to-one relationship with every one of them.
Well, let's get to that, because this is all about finding constructive solutions. But I want to go now, I want to go to Dennis now, who's been on the other side of this. If I understand it correctly, Dennis, you've been on the management side at a major healthcare organization in California or on the West Coast, or I guess nationwide. And I believe you've been involved in efforts to have a constructive relationship with labor rather than a adversarial relationship, although there's always going to be adversarial. I have adversaries with my family sometimes. But is that true, Dennis? And if so, can you give us a perspective on what the potential is for a constructive relationship with labor?
Oh, yes, that is true. And I've been in the automotive supplier business. I've been in the utility business. And my last job was in healthcare. And in all of those industries, we figured there was a different way, that we don't have to be adversaries. And it's more of, if you're going to have a union partner, then you should work with them in a different way. Unfortunately, most people don't know how to do that. The only way they know is adversarial. And as Chris just said, the relationship is set up to be adversarial from the first step. And to work in partnership is more difficult than to work adversarial. It's hard work. And people just don't know how to do it, which is one of the reasons we want to start giving this class is to teach people, here's a different way that works better, that's more effective, that gets better results. So.
And we'll get into this in getting back to you. Søren, I didn't get your last name right. Before we get in any way further, could you please pronounce your last name?
My name is Søren Viemose.
It's French almost. Okay, I should have tried that.
Yeah.
Søren, you come at this a great perspective, looking at your background. You deal with both sides, right? And you look like you have a little bit of experience having done that on your resume. So right now, or do you see any signs, and we're going to get more granularly, Chris, I'm going to come right back down to you. What could let's look at what a constructive relationship should look like. And Chris, when we get to you, I even want to discuss in an organizing effort, what would a constructive approach look like? What would an approach look like where a union is a value creator, perceived disruptor? But before we get to that, Søren, back to you. Do you see, first off, do you see any change, any signs? Obviously, you're part of this program of management. We didn't get good at, we're not getting great feedback from even companies that in the past have been worker-oriented, fighting unions, again, mentioning no names. Is there any improvement, or are we still back in the 19th century in labor management relationships in the US? I won't speak Europe.
Actually, Søren can speak about Europe, which
Yeah, I can speak about Europe, and that's actually the first point I want to make. I think we should all be very careful assuming that the way we do it in Europe could just be transformed into any other culture, just copy and insert. But I think inspiration of approaches and methods can maybe inspire, even though the conditions and the history is different. We have to go back to 1899 in Denmark, and where the first agreement between management and labor was made, that where the whole basis for the approach that we have in Denmark was established. The acknowledgement of each party's right to do their side, to organize, to make a labor contract, to have biannual labor contract negotiation, to sort of enhance the value of them. The whole system was started in the former century, not in the 19th, but in the 18th century, and that's what we still are building on. And I think it's the same in all of Scandinavia. But I think Dennis is making a very good starting point. It's much, much easier to say no than to say yes. It takes much more thoughts, labor, resources, time to find a thing that you can agree on than to just say no. And then give the other side the guilt of this situation. So I think we should start a discussion about how do you work if you want to reach a yes between labor and management. How do you approach a situation, even though it's contentious and it starts with a conflict? You have to have a sort of an understanding of this is the journey we are going to try to take now together. So.
Well, I even go back a little further because we have time. And I'm so glad. I didn't know we had a European perspective. This is fantastic, because what we really want to discuss is even back to before negotiations, right? What is the foundation of the relationship? That's going to depend upon the nature of the negotiations. If it's adversarial, it will be different than if it's a partnership. A marriage negotiation is different if people want to stay married than if they want to get divorced. So we'll get to that. And I think I'm going to come back around to you, and we're going to have time to share with us the European model. And I know it's not perfect. You have strikes there. But Chris, this gets to the issue I want to talk about. Is there a model for value for a union organization based on value creation in the United States? Because that's what it is in Europe. The unions play a role. They help with apprentice. We're going to get to that in CERN. You're going to tell us about that. But they play a role in training. They play a role in development. They play a role in employee voice. In some cases, each country is different. Each company is different. And France is quite different than Scandinavia. Okay, there we still have the class warfare. But in any case, Chris, is there a model where a union can come in and say, look, I can create value for management too. I can handle employee voice. I can handle human resources at scale in ways you can't. I can handle conflict better than you. I can be a partner. Does it always have to be adversarial? Are there ways? And I know, look, we all know in America today, you want to get views, get angry. You want to get clicks, be angry, be adversarial. Is there any room for love instead of fear in this?
You know what we say, organize with love, right? Maybe you know.
Where does that come from?
That
Sorry?
just comes from everyday life and organizing. You organize with love.
Well, I've never before. I live in New York. I ain't seen that, madam.
Yeah. I'd be interested in what Joel thinks about whether or not, we could ever use the word model, but we all know, or a lot of us know, a lot about how to create all the, kind of hundreds of ways that you could find to create a better, healthier relationship that is robust enough to support productivity, quality, but also to create a culture of kindness, of problem solving. Democracy is scary to everybody. Workers are exhausted, and you say, we're going to use our voices and we're going to solve problems. And they go like, can't you just fix it? Can't you just fix it? And the employer, I think, is, Dennis can answer this, but I think the employer is saying, we don't want these people anywhere around us. We don't want workers making decisions or bringing their lousy ideas into this process. But in fact, when we do it, as everybody has pointed out, it's kind of hard. But when we do it, it's amazingly effective. And the democracy that we create, a small d democracy, the capacity for voice that we create and for connection is actually not just good for the workplace, for productivity, for quality, for patient care, but it's actually good for the soul. And it's a good goal to think that both labor and management should be kind of cheerful in their endeavor to solve the problems of the workplace, that can be a very enriching process, not just for work outcomes, but for kind of the way we live our lives. We change the way work is when we do this, and it makes individuals, including managers, stronger. I hate to, but we said organize with love, so I think I can say happier, right?
Chris, it's interesting because we have another show that we did yesterday with experts in job design. And those say that, the critical part in job design is voice. And Joel, I think it was you who made a point in one of our other shows that a union can get voice much better than management. If I'm incorrectly attributing that to you, forgive me, but it's very wise, whoever said it. In other words, who am I going to trust more if I have a problem on the assembly line or in my office? The shop steward or my manager? And one of the key points of this job design expert, one of them was every employee should be checked in with somebody every 3 weeks or so. And on a scheduled basis, how are they? What's going on in the job? Blah, blah, blah. So Joel, and I've worked for unions and I've seen the destructive elements of unions. I've been told not to work hard by a shop steward. Don't stand out. but I've also seen good things that unions have done in terms of providing benefits, voice, and support I would have never gotten otherwise. So Joel, have you seen any instances, and we're going to get back to you, Dennis, because I think you have an example of one, of and I know we have examples that Dennis is going to be shared of a unionized company that has said, I'm going to be smart about this and turn it into potentially a value creator. But have you seen any instances, and Chris, maybe you'll be able to answer this also, where it, even before we get to that part that Dennis said, okay, I can be negative about this or positive about this, even before that, where you have management and labor saying, hey, let's sit down. We've got a big workforce here, a lot of challenges. We have financial challenges. Let's sit down and get this work together. Have you seen any signs of that yet? Or is that still fantasy land?
So the four of us here are part of a 10-person team that will be delivering in the years to come a seminar from Brandeis University on negotiating labor agreements. And at the heart of that seminar, and of course the focus of today's conversation, are three thoughts. The first is that the collective bargaining process itself can be run in a more problem-solving way that will better achieve outcomes for all parties. First thought. The second thought is that collective bargaining doesn't exist separately from the frontline workforce operations, where both Chris and Dennis can share with you examples as concern of unit-based teams or frontline teams that drive continuous improvement in transformative ways. And collective bargaining can both set the stage for that frontline innovation and can then codify innovation and extend it as things emerge. The third point, which I'd like to get to before we're done this talk, is at the strategic level. There are societal interests that are at stake with labor management relations. And we'll come back to it in a little bit, but there's a lot to be said for the role and voice of other stakeholders when it comes to collective bargaining. But let's turn to really all three of our guests, because they can speak to how in collective bargaining you can reach agreements that set the stage for frontline workforce-led joint union management innovation, because it's a lose-lose if the employee has to choose between their union rep and their supervisor, that you really want them to be in a frontline work experience in which their supervisor and their union rep are aligned in support of their work every day.
Well, that's a great segue for Dennis. So Dennis, share with us, and then we're going to get to the some European examples from CERN, of how unions working with management actually creates value rather than adversary. And I would imagine that the number one foundational element is trust, I would think. And I would think to create trust, the number two element is transparency. I don't see how we can negotiate and collectively bargain unless everybody sees the financials and what the purpose and goals of the organization are and what the promises are being made to stakeholders. But I'm going to turn that over to you. I believe you've been involved with a different model. Cautioning you that I have two family members who were part of Kaiser Permanente, but I'm kidding you, they're long gone. I'm just teasing. Other than that, they were, but go ahead.
I was going to say that's great. If they're a part of Kaiser Permanente, then they know how good things can be in a different work environment. I think I'll add to your two elements, relationship. The relationship between management and union is also important. And when you've founded a relationship based on trust, based on openness, based on looking at each other's views and trying to figure out how do we help accomplish something versus how do we destroy something. And you talk about creating value. The value that I used to see as I went around Kaiser Permanente was no one knows how to do the work better than people on the front line, whether it's in a hospital, a utility company, an automotive company. No one knows that work like the person on the front line. And when you tap into that resource, and the way that tap into that resource is jointly with labor, employees give you this extra, I call it oomph, that you can't pay for. You can't give them another $5 hour raise to get that extra effort out of employees that you get when management and labor are working together. I looked at employees in like neonatal units who watched our patients struggle with the fact that they couldn't see their premature babies 24/7. And I watched employees come up with ideas of let's mount cameras in the incubators and give parents access so they can see their newborn child 24/7. That's something that you can't pay for. That's something employees give you. That adds value and your patients appreciate it. So your patients have better outcomes when you're working together. So to me, it's like a no-brainer when you're in that type of environment and you're working together. And I look at it and say, I don't understand why most companies don't work this way. It's fascinating to me that they're not tapping into that resource.
Well, we're going to get back to you on that. Søren, kind of, let's use the Scandinavian model. Yes, you're right. We can't transplant everything that Europe does, but you're about ready to. I don't know whether you folks are aware of something called the European Union Corporate Sustainability Responsibility Directive. Have you folks heard about that? Where companies, 3,000 companies or more in the US are going to have to disclose their unionization rates, their employee voice, their employee turnover, their gender disparities. It's unbelievable. But and you've heard of the GDPR privacy law that has so much changed the world. You ain't seen nothing yet. Google it. See what the lawyers are saying. This is a revolution coming. It's all about transparency, right? Well, transparency is coming. And by the way, the law covers all stakeholders, employees, customers, the workplace of your supply chain, and your communities and the environment. It's really something. Anyway, and so Europe, yes, you are changing the world. So Søren, give us a model of how unions work constructively to create value rather than destroy, as they're viewed in this country as value by the management, of course, as value destroyers. How in Europe do unions work together with management to solve problems to enhance the industry, the company, and is trust indeed critical?
Well, first of all, there are some conditions that have been built up over many, many years. For instance, the basic trust of each other, that we are legitimate partners. You have your approach, we have our approach. The other difference is that the unions, at least in Northern Europe, not in France, as you said, but in Northern Europe, has been central for the development of the social system of the country. The security, we call it in Denmark, flex security, so that it's extremely flexible to be on the job market. You can sort of go in and out and it's not dangerous. You don't lose anything when you get fired. You are taken care of. And all of these systems sort of supports a system that even what you would call the right wing of the Scandinavian government supports this system because it works. So we have some conditions. Then we have some institutions that has been built up for a long time that sort of support the negotiation. We have systems that we have acknowledged rounds of negotiations on all levels. Then we have a very high unionization. In some branches, it's 80–90% of the employers that are the employees that are unionized. I think even the Prime Minister of Denmark is in a union, so it's something that you are. It's actually a little no-go to not be a part of a union, because the union has a much wider scope than getting pay raises. It works with many different issues, so there are many different contacts between you and your union. So I want to go back to how you do this. I think, Dennis, your work, which everybody can Google, is an inspiration many, many places in the world. There has been researchers documenting your work and the effects, at least some years ago. I don't know how the situation is now, but I think that is the way to go, to have examples of, good examples of, here they did something that actually created value, that management and labor, both sides, appreciate and are willing to show to others. You have to have these examples of these good examples to build up inspiration for others, because just as it's easier to say no, it's easier to communicate failures than successes. So you have to emphasize and sort of fan the successes. I have many examples, but we can maybe come into that later. But it's the good examples that sort of contaminates the whole thing with another approach. But you have to have good examples. You cannot just talk it into people's heads.
Well, we are going to have time to get back to you. I would like to focus on when we get back to you, how in Europe more specifically, unions are creating value. Because one of the messages and Chris, I'm now getting back to you. Again, I've worked for unions. I was in the journalism union, multiple unions. Okay, so I've experienced both sides of it. And I know that unions can create value. I know they can. But that was, a lot of us who've been in unions, we know it because we got benefits from it. But it would seem to me that there are massive ways that unions can create value. And that a smart company might even go, wait a minute, I'm paying all these human resources people. I'm paying for benefits am I getting proper scale on my benefits when I'm only one company? If I'm with a union with 80 companies, I might get better scale. I might get better support. I might have a better conflict resolution methodology. I have never seen a union, but again, I'm just a business journalist. I don't know more than general folks. I've never seen a union go out there and say, hey, I'm good for business. I'm not just good for employees. I'm good for business. Is there any model for a union promoting itself as a value creator rather than as protecting legitimate rights of people that usually are being mistreated? Let's face it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure there's as I said before, I think that there are kind of thousands of ways that you can do this, but that there isn't a model. Like for me, I do this kind of labor management relations, this kind of organizing. Some people think it's just too soft. It's almost, organize around love. Don't organize against the employer. Employer is irrelevant. Create your own healthy organization, and then engage in fixing things, right? And based on the idea that the workers, especially when they're together, can think together about everything. They have more institutional knowledge than the employer has, right? They have just more institutional memory than the employer, especially if they're organized. So the thing about it is that there's stigma, I think, attached for both labor and management. I spend all day, every day trying to soothe employers into being able to work with workers in a problem-solving way. And that's the bulk of what I do. And I think that employers are hesitant always to even engage. I mean, this week I had this issue that came to my attention of a woman, a doctor, who was severely threatened, her life threatened by a patient. And it was 2 months ago, and no one in this hospital, no one in management has spoken to her about it. very severe kind of situation. And I think that the reason that that abyss is there is because the system is so adversarial that maybe what would happen is if you talk to her, you might think you might get sued. I don't know what it is really, but there's just no conversation that's happening about it. So it feels to her, of course, like no support, but it might feel to them like, let's get as far away from this as we can. That's how it is on the shop floor. And sometimes as a labor leader in America, because I've been in this game for 40 or 50 years, I often kind of wake up in the morning and think like, maybe the employers that I'm dealing with are the only ones that are resistant to this set of ideas. Maybe they're the only ones, but I really don't think so. And it takes a while to get workers there too, right? Because workers basically want you, especially at first, they want you to just
get them more money.
Well, you get to money, you want something, you want justice, you want love, you want whatever, and you can't get it, so you take money, right?
But-
I mean, I'm not saying that people don't
That's-
care about money or money's not important, but
Happened.
let me before we go ahead, Bruce, let me share another example that is on the positive side, that actually is a group that Chris helped to organize early on at UMass Memorial in central Massachusetts. So a union that Chris co-founded, the Share Union, represents about 3,000 frontline workers at that facility, along with others in the region. And just last year, they were in collective bargaining. And in some training that I was involved in, we had put on the table the interest of other stakeholders. 75 years ago, the head of the Wage and Price Commission during World War II, George Taylor, had famously said that if society doesn't see its interest represented in collective bargaining as an institution will be at risk, which sadly has happened. But based on that discussion, the parties said this really needs to be a conversation not just between labor and management, but also taking into account the interest of patients. And as it happens, on both the union and management bargaining teams, there were members of the PFAC, the Patient Advisory Committee that most hospitals have. So they spoke to the Patient Advisory Committee and said, we're about to go into bargaining. Would you like us to meet with you? And the patient group said, of course. And it was supposed to be a half an hour on the agenda, and it went on for an hour and a half. In fact, I was able to observe along with the head of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, because we were both interested in this innovation. And the patients had a number of things to say about to both labor and management going into collective bargaining. A few months later, to the parties' credit, they reached a settlement, and they went back to the Patient Advisory Committee and said, would you like to hear how we took into account your interest? And of course, the committee said, absolutely. And what they reported is that they had reached an agreement that included how the frontline unit-based teams would give more opportunities for patient voice. There were a number of things that they built into their agreement to take into account the interest of patients as a union management relationship. That's a small example, but I will tell you that beforehand, both union and management were nervous because they think of this as just a bilateral relationship. And this is exactly what Chris was saying, will this disrupt our relations by bringing in this other third party, the patients? And of course, it turned out to be highly generative.
Well, this is stakeholder capitalism at work, because
exactly.
what organizations discover is that we are in, and this is Edward Friedman's work from 1983, Stakeholder Management, or famous book, Strategic Management, Stakeholder Theory. Stakeholder capitalism is a system, not an ideology. You cannot organize. An organization is made up of interrelated stakeholder relationships, and that's what creates value. And unless we do that, so Dennis, back to you, because I think you do provide a Kaiser Permanente, whatever issues, people always criticize things if they're not perfect. I'm sorry, nothing's perfect. We have to look at things in terms of continuous improvement. And I think what I've heard about Kaiser is pretty incredible. So what would well, actually, that'll be your last question. I hope we'll have time for it. So let me ask you, what were the ways, when you were there, that you were working constructively with the union? If you could just, were they involved with benefits management? Were they involved with voice, continuous improvement? How did your relationship with unions create value?
I'm going to say they were involved in all of those things, but the things that come to mind are the I'm going to call it the enemy that attacked our business. I call it Ebola. I call it COVID. I call it all of those emergencies that all of a sudden we were facing. And to have a labor partner that's working with you to address those issues is what I saw at Kaiser Permanente. And then the other thing I want to just throw out here is it's not willy-nilly. We measured employees in what we call unit-based teams. And what we found is that people in unit-based teams, we had better customer satisfaction in those areas. We had better attendance. We had better everything that we measured. And so we constantly measured how much better performance we had where we had this joint management partnership and employees were engaged. So there was a lot of data that we accumulated to show the value of what we were doing.
And Dennis, you might say just how many teams we're talking about?
There were about 3,500 teams when I left.
So, Søren, since we are running low on time, on a fascinating conversation I could spend all day at, Søren, what would you, again, you seem to be a very humble man that's not going to dare tell Americans how they should run their culture. I dare you to do that.
Wow.
Just if you had to tick off the areas where unions can create value, theoretically, where they can help management, I'll give you one thing: HR. I mean, every CEO hates. I mean, I'm sorry to all those HR viewers, but remember, HR has many components to it. But what other areas can unions add value to corporations in Europe? Why basically most corporations, besides the fact that you have a cultural acceptance in Scandinavia, which helps?
Yeah, I think in many areas, and it's actually becoming more and more systemized in the biannual negotiations, because there's a lot of issues that are not sort of fitting into the labor contract in itself. So now a lot of unions sort of say, okay, we have also this more strategic issue here. We cannot write that into this contract, but we can make a joint project that sort of develops this issue until next time. We get clever, we change something in collaboration, we have, and they start doing things in between the negotiations together to sort of handle a problem. For instance, in the health sector, to find out how do we keep nurses in the hospitals even though they are worn out and stressed. Can we make a joint project where you from the union side supports the things that we do from the management side and vice versa? How would that situation, how could we do that? And they will start working on that in that 2-year period and find out, okay, now we know a lot of things. Now we can make a concrete agreement that can be implemented in any of the hospitals in Denmark. So there's a lot of collaboration going on between the negotiations on issues that are issues for both sides, but with a different approach, and that this difference approach is acknowledged as a starting point, that okay, you go into this project because you hope to find this or this, and we go into it because you hope to find this or this. I have just been on a tour in a bus for many months with the management side of the public sector, the highest level directors of the negotiating organization in the state, and about 20 unions, and we drove around in a bus to look into the system. Can the system in itself, the negotiation system in itself, be developed so that it can provide more value for the public sector in Denmark? And we have been visiting many counties and cities and interviewing 40, 60 people every place to find out how can we create more value.
Well, by the way, we need
Starting point of that was that they acknowledge that you go on this tour because you hope to prove that this is not working, and you go on this tour because you want to prove another thing. But both parties were surprised what they saw and learned a lot together. So now they are implementing a lot of new initiatives based on that.
Well, I'm sorry that we're running toward the end of the program. It's fascinating. And by the way, this is the big lesson. Get people together in a room. You know, we don't even have to train them. Get them on a room to solve a problem. And a lot of
magic. Put them in a bus.
Put them in a bus for a couple of months. Chris,
Yes.
you've been look way too young to have all the years of experience that you say you have, but I'm going to give you a tough question from someone. Do you think that there is any signs in the union movement for a happiness approach? You know, in other words, to look at the approach that is happening in Europe, where when we go to organize, where instead of just saying, you know, to the workers, join us because of your anger, no, join us because we can make this business better by working together. Is there any appetite, or are we still stuck in the dark ages?
Oh, dark ages. I think that the unions are under an enormous amount of pressure to express worker rage and misery, and it makes it very difficult for them to think about a different approach, a different cultural approach. And often when I talk to labor leaders about this kind of thing, they'll say to me, all you're telling me is how to get unelected. This model is too complex, and it's not, there's not enough red meat. And I'm sure managers have their own red meat, right? But we're very, very binary. And so we're just experiencing completely different things depending on which side of the labor management line we're on. If we have unions, even traditional unions, that's way better because we can actually talk to each other, and we may be in a slow lane and just kind of solving individual workplace problems and negotiating wages and that kind of thing. But at least we have a capacity to talk to each other. And then the idea of moving into, you know, a richer, deeper problem-solving model, joint model, involved in all the things that Soren and Dennis are talking about, that's really far away in the US, and we're not promoting it in unions, I think, because there's just so much pressure to be against the command and control systems that are in place.
Perfect.
And we don't know what to do.
Dennis, you couldn't have said it better. Dennis, because you're going to have the last word, Joel, on that question, and also just to tell us a quick thing about the program, which I think is there to begin and maybe change that, hopefully. Dennis, what about your side? I would have to probably agree from what I see. Do you see any real change yet in the United States between management and this distrust? I think it just gets down to distrust. Is there, I know you folks are involved in this education program to perhaps change it, but right now, if you were to benchmark things at the beginning of your new program, it's at a pretty low point in the US, isn't it, in terms of trust between labor unions and management to really work together to make things better?
It gets to the question you were asking Chris earlier, what's the value proposition? And I don't think management at this point sees the value in joining together with labor or allowing itself to be organized. It's destructive to their business models, not creative. And until they see a value in it, they're not going to accept it with open arms.
So we are caught, I am afraid, in sort of a vicious cycle. So Joel, and you and I just did a show the other day on DEI, and I got a very big pushback from somebody when I said that I think that the argument needed to be made on a economic argument. That yes, it was more morally smart and correct to have DEI, but that hasn't worked, and that we have to make an economic argument. And I can tell you, I lost a few hairs on the response I got from that individual that no, this is a human right, it's an economic right, and blah blah blah. And that struck me, I hate to say it, is a little bit of the same attitude we're finding here in management relationships. We've got a sort of a sunk in attitudes on both sides, management distrust, labor distrust. Is your school about doing something to change that?
So the new program, which we're calling Negotiating Labor Agreements, which includes these amazing 3 individuals that you've met, myself and a number of others. There's 6 of us on the faculty, including a colleague from Australia, which is doing work around Fair Work. The whole Fair Work Commission in Australia it plays an interesting role in this context. But at the core of this program is the notion that even a union or management leader in a traditional adversarial relationship can benefit by learning skills and methods that avoid collapse and catastrophic conflict, and can learn how to take adversarial conversations and turn them into problem-solving relationships. So even at the extremes that both Chris and Dennis were describing, there are skills and methods that are important to learn and that will produce better outcomes. But I would say the conversation doesn't stop there. It is also possible to take this institution itself, collective bargaining, and transform it into one that is truly a valued social institution. In Northern Europe, as CERN has been describing, it doesn't mean that there's not conflict. It doesn't mean that there aren't hard issues, but that it's possible to shape the institution in ways that are beneficial for management in terms of its objectives, labor in terms of its objectives, and other societal stakeholders. So think of this as a seminar that begins the conversation where folks are at and helps to move the conversation towards, frankly, institutional innovation in society.
Well, it all starts with trust at the end of the day. And it's a trust, unfortunately, that's fundamentally lacking in this country. And I think if I had to summarize what I've heard today, is that this is just another proof that shareholder capitalism is not as efficient as we like to pretend it is. It's actually massively inefficient, because look at all the waste that we are building into our organizations that is not being picked up in the balance sheets or in the P&L. And that is the waste of all this conflict, this waste of all the failure to solve problems. So our organization is dedicated, and it will be like you, Joel, probably until you drop, to doing something to change it, because it's just better business. It's just more practical. Well, anyway, I cannot thank all of you enough for your contribution to what I think is a really, we'll summarize this, but your key findings are that there's a lot of value to be created by labor management relationships, that it can be built into labor management negotiations at the very least, that your organization is going to help teach people that are interested about it. And that Chris and Dennis, capitalism does have a way of eventually finding the things that are more efficient. And remember total quality management back in the 90s, found on road dead, right? American quality has gone up dramatically when we simply applied a strategic and systematic approach. And maybe common sense will reign in this important area. Thank you, all of you, for your great work. And Joel, I'll be there to promote everything you do all you have to do is ask. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks much.
Thank you.
Thank you.